Okay, I think we're ready to go. My name is Jack Young, and I'm a research manager at CIRIA. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar supported by CIRIA's new Geospatial Community of Practice and explore the topic of what is Earth observation and why should I care? Before we begin, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping points. So today's webinar is being recorded. Presentations and recording will be made available at a later date. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please raise your hand or send a chat message if you have any problems with your connection or audio, and one of the CIRIA team will be there to help you out in the background. We do have a dedicated Q&A session after the presentations. However, during the sessions, please type the questions into the Q&A box and state if you wish to direct your question to a particular speaker. We'll be monitoring questions as they come in, so feel free to click the thumbs up button on other people's questions or comments to make sure you like other questions and help us identify which ones to go over first in the Q&A session. Feel free to also share resources in chat. We're very keen to hear about your webinar experience throughout the session, and would also be very grateful if you could complete the short poll at the end of the webinar. This is something you'd have to complete as well if you'd like to receive CPD after the event. Feel free to share your views and experiences today through Twitter or LinkedIn through the handle shown at the bottom of the screen, along with the hashtags as well. We aim to be finished at 12:30, so as far as technology goes, we should be underway shortly and things should go to plan. So just with a quick overview of who CIRIA are, for those that aren't fully aware, we recently celebrated our 60th anniversary as a not-for-profit member-based organisation. Our core strength has always been improving performance through collaboration in the built environment and construction sectors. So we do this by delivering independent guidance such as the SUDS Manual, ROC Manual, International Levy Handbook, as well as a whole host of guides such as biodiversity net gain, asbestos. And as most of you will know here today, we have a very strong legacy of asset management and geotechnical guides, including structural health monitoring, stuff on UAVs, non-destructive testing, and more recently GIS for infrastructure, and the use of INSAR and Earth observation for infrastructure as well. We organise around 50 events per year, mostly online at the moment, ranging from topical conferences, annual debates, and lectures to webinars such as today's event. We are a small but growing organisation with around 80 members, which you can see on the slide here. So it's really great to see many of you here today as well. So let's introduce the chair and begin the first presentation. So welcome Ian Mackenzie, who is our principal geotechnical engineer at Welsh Government, who will be giving us a bit of background on CIRIA's Geospatial Community of Practice. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Jack. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so what brings us here today? Well, working with Earth observation data is not a new concept for people in the built environment and the construction industry, but there are big changes going on at the moment, and there is an opportunity definitely to use the data in more constructive ways. It is an ever-developing digital environment that's out there, and there is obviously always an opportunity to collaborate and educate the industry at a base level, providing people with information, encourage usage, and giving people confidence to use it for the first time, or just provide more information to people who are frequent users. So this morning, what we're going to go and try and do is talk through how that might be used for different or key sectors. We're going to focus on transportation, biodiversity. We were going to cover water utility as well, but unfortunately our speaker is not able to turn up today. We will get back to that at a later event, I promise. And we're going to try and explore how Earth observation information is integrated into the way that people work at the moment. And for each of the sectors, what we're going to try and do is ask how much does Earth observation influence the sector at the moment? What data is available and what it can be used for? And where can people get this data? And what are the challenges that might be expected when people are actually using it? So presentations, we're going to be a series of examples, really, and case studies, all about using connecting technology and facing the challenges that we all face at the moment. So this morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Drew Hill, who is the Senior Environmental Engineer at Transport Scotland, Jennifer Schuyler, who is the Head of Product at SatSense, and later on it will be Ollie Thomas, who is the Principal Consultant for Geospatial Data Visualization at Arcadis, and Madeline Chura, who is the Consultant Ecologist at Arcadis. So at this point, I am contractually obliged to say a little bit about the geospatial community of practice. So we are a fairly new organisation or affiliation. It started last year, really, or the year before, and it followed on from CIRIA's guidance documents that were prepared on the GIS for infrastructure and INSAR and Earth observation for civil engineers. I'm not sure how many people really understand the process that goes into producing the CIRIA reports. There's a lot of work involved in that, and it takes a couple of years to do. There's a key authorship team who obviously draft the bulk of the document, but behind that as well, there's a project steering group, and that's usually 20 or 30 people who are experts in their field, part of the industry, and they guide, steer, edit, provide advice to the authorship team. And at the end of those two key documents, it really felt that the group of people, the authorship team and the project steering group, really they developed a good bond, and they wanted to carry on that good work, and felt that it shouldn't stop just with the production of these reports. We wanted to try and carry things forward and embed some of the findings in the industry. So that's why the community of practice was set up, really. So it is a practitioners network. It focuses on collaboration and its knowledge transfer, improving awareness for all the geospatial developments and trying to get them embedded in the wider construction industry. So, I mean, who are we trying to target here? It's asset owners and it's infrastructure operators, advisors, decision makers, the consultants that make up the delivery of those aspects, asset managers, anybody that's interested in the sort of digital transformation and strategies that go around to that. We hold about 2 or 3 events. This is our second webinar that we've done, and we've got more planned for coming up. So there'll be seminars, debates, and it's just generating an interest in what we do. There is if there is a motto that we have, it is demystifying the art of Earth observation to the sector. That includes demystifying it for me as well, to be honest, at times. But I'm learning an awful lot as we go through this. I should say that really it's an inclusive organisation. We're really grateful to the core members at the moment who are sponsoring it and helping it develop. So that's Acetera, Geofem, Sixth Sense, the British Geotechnical Association, Ordnance Survey, Environment Agency, and SatSense. But we encourage other people to join and take part as well. So if you want to get involved, please do. So I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. That's my that's the contractual obligation over, and now we can get on with the presentations, I think, properly. So the first speakers this morning are Drew Hill, who is Environmental Engineer in Transport Scotland, and Jennifer Schuyler, who's the Head of Product at SatSense, and they're going to talk about Earth observation within the transportation sector. Now, just before Jack did mention it, if you have questions, if you could put them in the question box, we'll pick them up at the discussion section at the end. And you can also click on the thumbs up if you like the question somebody else has asked, and that'll help us identify which ones are popular. And at this point, I think it's going to be Drew that starts off speaking.
Hello,
Drew?
can everybody hear?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay. Hello, I'm Drew Hill. Good morning, everybody. I'm a senior environmental engineer in Transport Scotland. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I have a 50-minute presentation, 14 slides, try and keep to time. I'll provide some background thoughts and observations on Earth observation and transport, and end with some of the key challenges for the sector and the Earth observation in question. As Ian mentioned, the three questions I hope to cover in these 14 slides are: how much does Earth observation influence the sector? What data is available and what can it be used for? Where can I get this data, and what challenges are expected? And that's the last slide I have that will probably take 3 or 4 minutes, and there are a few quick challenges I think are active in the sector that would be worth maybe discussing later. I started by preparing for this presentation. I thought I'd begin by looking at a few definitions of Earth observation, and the most useful two I could find were the gathering of information about the physical, chemical, and biological systems of planet Earth, and the process of gathering information about the Earth from a range of sensors to provide monitoring data at a range of scales. And I thought, I've been involved gathering data and a whole range of information in my day job and working in other organizations, and I like GIS and geospatial information and how that comes together to answer a problem. But I recognize that Earth observation, that there's three main types there: in situ surface, which is essential on the ground; non-satellite remote sensing, which I saw as in the air, aircraft or unmanned aerial vehicles gathering things like, air quality information or noise information or information that can be received in that way, and then remote sensing from sensors and satellites. And as I thought about that perspective, I recognized that transport organizations gather a lot of that data anyway, and I'll just maybe cover some of that. Apologies for this blending that slipped into the presentation. How is it performed? So there's a significant scale in relation to Earth observation. The sector's huge. It's £1 billion sector, large value, and recent advances have been driven by AI, ever-increasing computer power, and reducing costs of storage. And you can see that in 2020, a real push there in terms of satellites, but the technology, AI, information is allowing that data to be blended and morphed much more in a much more significant way, and directed towards solving problems that the transport sector has. And there's a whole range of innovation that some of which I'll mention in this presentation that's taking place right now. The list of types on the right includes some of the technology used to capture transport data in the transport sector, with in-vehicle data and satellite data being perhaps the most promising. I know that transport organizations are looking strongly now at in-vehicle data, vehicle-to-vehicle data, vehicle-to-road data, and how that can be used to answer some of the problems and challenges we have. I thought we'd drop this slide in just to highlight that Scotland is leading on satellite information and gathering that kind of type of data at the time of writing or the preparation of this slide. There's around 29 companies directly involved in the Earth observation space downstream sector, and 130 companies indicated space activity. And I looked into the background of some of this work, and some of the key things I found were that there's a whole range of uses that this information from satellites are providing, but they've classified 240 billion trees, they monitor biodiversity loss, they monitor pollution levels in the atmosphere. A quick review of the Earth observation sector suggested there's 6 industries responsible for 94% of the value generated, listed on the left. And most of those will be discussed today by myself and others, but supply chain and transport at the bottom is the topic I'm discussing now. The key areas of application I found are shown on the right, and these link closely with the data gathered in the transport sector. So climate research, conservation, disaster management, environmental monitoring. these are all things that we'll use. The transport sector uses Earth observation for disaster management, resilience, really robust pieces of work that we require that data provides significant value to. This slide covers the transport sector use and how in the transport sector we use data. So the key areas, as just mentioned previously, are those ones on the left. And I think asset management and disaster response, transport operation, environmental assessment, all of those areas are areas that we gather a wide range of data that others will be talking about today in specific detail to inform decision making, and that information enhances the efficient safety and sustainability of transport in all of its modes and provides valuable data and insights. It's interesting as well that approximately 50% of the world's population live in urban areas. So the transport within those dense areas requires that more detailed, more accurate information, and maybe more timely information that helps support decision making. And on the bottom right, I think that environmental observation provides insight before and after monitoring, condition assessment, and asset register data. All of those require really detailed pieces of information that help inform that decision making. How do we use this data and decision making? There's a whole range of ways, but I thought it'd be useful to pull some of the things that we do in this brief slide. We use information, Earth observation, and other data in a blended way for active and passive use. So we provide live traffic information or data on journeys to the public that allows them to make better journey decisions. We use that information to calibrate and validate models that we use for scheme design and assessment, cost-benefit analysis. We use that information in terms of a resilience response in a more detailed way. So detailed meteorological flooding analysis from a whole range of observation sets of data in a blended way gives us really accurate information in relation to the impact of a storm event, for example, that allows us to focus resources in a really effective way. And we also use it in policy making. So decision making and policy making and wider influence on transport were the three key areas I thought we use, or data is used in the transport sector. So we use Earth observation information as evidence. And just shown some of the reports that Transport Scotland have recently shaped that require that level of information and data and evidence along with other sets of evidence. So Clean Air for Scotland, the Just Transition, the climate change. But other organisations deliver a whole range of other policy documents or approaches or strategies that require that data to ground the evidence and provide a pathway. Adaptation pathways is key to, I think, to spending resources as we head forward to embrace the climate change challenge. So identifying the route through that and the right time and the right triggers, Earth observation data adds significant value to that. How does it influence transport more broadly? There are opportunities in the potential of Earth observation data to influence the transport sector in terms of management and maintenance, reducing environmental impact, encouraging modal shift, improving safety, and managing adaptation is significant, with new technology providing robust opportunities to innovate and collaborate. Mobility as a service, for example, in the top right, will both require and support better travel information to allow decisions to be made on the best way to undertake a journey. An aviation example is in the bottom right of innovation using Earth observation data. It's the data from Edinburgh Airport Noise Lab, and I think Glasgow Airport has the same sort of tool. Other airports use similar approaches. That system involves on the ground noise monitoring that it continuously assesses the noise levels of aircraft passing over them on the flight path. And in the left corner there, you can see a peak. And I carried this out late at night, and there's a slight delay, so you can't see the aircraft on the map. But that system's live. So you can that graph on the left continuously moves. And the system's also closely linked to the expected noise level from aircraft being tracked. So it can be used to work out if there's an exceedance in a particular aircraft, but it can also be used to handle noise complaints. There's just one example. Data sources, there's a wide range of data sources, and thinking about how Earth observation matures as an industry requires consideration of how that information is used within fixed legacy systems that transport organizations have, how we gather in-vehicle data, how we use remote sensing and satellite data. I hope I'm doing okay for time. But there's also the issue in relation to storage and analysis. So how do we store that data? Okay, organizations store their own mission critical data in a controlled way that is managed and is shared in a limited way, but self-secure. But that information could be shared more broadly with partners and allow that wider collaboration. What's the sandbox? Where do we build models? What's publicly available? How do we develop the range of tools that we need? And one of the approaches that organizations think about in relation to data and how that information is used is that they follow the FAIR principles. So the data is findable. It's of no value if it's in a box under somebody's desk. It can be shared, accessible. So it needs to be available to all, interoperable. It needs to work in a range of systems. And it's all very well having a set of data out there, but if it's not usable on standard machines or standard, it's not to be reusable. It doesn't erode, decay, become out of date, or the license expire. And also one of the other things that may be useful is that data can come back again in some shared form when it's developed to those that put it out for offer. So two quick examples, and I think these are the last 2 or 3 slides in this section, is two examples that I'm involved in that we've been tracking and thinking about are noise cameras, where we can use, we can see the diagram there, that it's essentially a microphone that array that can determine the noise source in a moving, in a 3-dimensional frame, and then link that to the video or of the movement that's happening and show a red dot of where the major noise source is, record those noise levels, and use that to target nuisance vehicles or gather information on nuisance vehicles, and then work out what to do with that. Perhaps think about enforcement or awareness raising, or share that information with the public in relation to a particularly noisy vehicle and manage that noise nuisance. The other one is a CPEC survey that involves measuring the acoustic properties of the road surface and using this to develop quieter road surfacing. Interestingly, in preparing for this presentation, both of those new techniques are very similar to a traditional road measurement vehicle I saw in a picture that showed a service that was delivered. It still is delivered, but it's a system that data could actually be gathered by vehicles as they travel up and down the road. More modern vehicles that have got a wider range of sensors, and that data can be captured and harvested and shared to carry out a similar assessment, but that's kind of work in progress. The last 2 slides are, this one's on data maturity and transport sector organizations. This is from the Data Orchard. It's a freely available tool that allows assessment of data maturity of organizations. So there's 7 themes and a series of questions under those themes. Organizations are provided with a tool and a series of questions that they answer, and rank the questions to the responses to those questions alongside evidence, and work out what the data maturity of the organization is. And the headings are essentially, across a range of not performing at all to being expert in the field, emerging, learning, developing, and mastering at the high end. And the last slide, to maybe support any discussion, are some of the questions I thought were relevant for the transport sector, and maybe Earth observation more widely in relation to what we could perhaps be discussing today. So learning by doing is part of the process. And interestingly, when I prepared for this presentation, I looked up some Earth observation quotations, and the one I found most relevant was from Isaac Asimov, who said, "The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but, oh, that's funny." I think learning by doing and gathering data together and then finding out, asking questions of that data and then finding out pathways on how that data can be used is really important. Some key questions to consider as we go forward, I think, are, you can read the ones on the left there, but where do we store the data? What do we share? How can we build a collaborative sandbox? There are a range of partners in academia and industry working in this space and seeking joint solutions. We need to keep a human in the loop. Where in the loop is she placed? Decision making, filtering, cleaning. What tools do we use? Open source or proprietary? Both have merits. And lastly, it's interesting to note that the DFT transport strategy lists the following key themes, perhaps related to development of Earth observation in the transport sector: sharing, discovery, and access, data standards and quality, skills, culture, and leadership, user needs and communication, governance, protection, and ethics. I think those challenges, they are linked to the DFT transport strategy recommendations or themes, and that's perhaps the themes and questions we should be thinking about for the sector. How can we work collaboratively to develop this industry and economy? Finally, thanks for listening. All comments and input welcome. My email is drew.hill@transport.gov.scot. Now over to Jennifer for a detailed review of satellite Earth observation and its application in the transport sector.
Great, thank you, Drew, for that great broad kind of introduction to Earth observation for the transport sector. So I'm going to now kind of go much more narrow and talk about specifically INSAR for transport monitoring, and that's specifically a satellite remote sensing technique. And I'm going to start with a poll that should have just popped up on your screen. So for the audience here, I want to know, have you used INSAR data in your projects before? So not just heard of it, but kind of actively used it in a project before. And we'll leave that up for a few minutes to give you all a chance to vote. In the meantime, if kind of INSAR doesn't mean anything to you at the moment, it stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar. And this is what a classical kind of INSAR map looks like. You might see a few different color bars, but ultimately red is usually subsiding or movement or kind of away from the satellite. White areas in this image are stable and blue areas are either heaving or moving towards the satellite. And you can think of this map as kind of millions of GPS-like data points. So every point on that map has a time series associated with it. And you can see one of those time series in the left there that's showing subsidence of about 20 mil over about 3 years. You can think of this as an opportunistic data technique as well. So that means we're not installing things on the ground. You don't know exactly where there's going to be reflectors, but you can, roads, for example, generally get good data coverage, and buildings and things like that. As you'll already notice, agricultural fields, trees and forests at a lot of SAR wavelengths don't generally get good signals. So that is a limitation. And in terms of kind of the frequency that data is being acquired, we're talking at the moment around 30 times per year. So every 11 or 12 days, you essentially get a data point for this time series. I'm just trying to move the slide forward. There we go. Yeah, so how does INSAR work? I've already said this is a satellite remote sensing technique. So I won't go into today all the different satellites that we use, but this is a video of one of the European Space Agency satellites. On Drew's slide, Sentinel-2 mentioned there, which is an optical or multispectral sensor. These are radar satellites, and Sentinel-1 is one of the most famous European Space Agency satellites that is used. Ultimately for INSAR, what you're measuring is a change in phase. So if between the 2 times that the satellite flies over, if the ground moves, you can essentially measure the change in phase. So you can think of that as the distance between the satellite and the ground. And you can do that with millimeter precision. So really looking at how the ground has moved in a matter of millimeters. In terms of the transport sector, there's quite a lot of different applications of INSAR and SAR data. So the advantages of using satellites, of course, is that they're able to do wide area monitoring. So that's an entire network. For example, we were monitoring Network Rail's, entire rail network using satellite data. In the UK, landslides and slope stability issues are particularly common ones where users are really interested in looking at these millimeter displacements and identifying when acceleration has occurred as a possible precursor to failure. Geotechnical support, so where should engineers go out on this network? You can't be site inspecting everywhere all the time, so using this for proactive maintenance. Tunneling, another very common one. There are many examples of tunneling projects in London where you can see a very clear surface signal of the subsidence above the TBM. So that's another example. Also bridges and a bit of flood mapping as well. So what type of questions are we trying to answer with INSAR data? So it's, where and on which asset is movement occurring? As already mentioned, on a network-wide scale, knowing where to go out, where to maintain, and prioritize that work. What's the magnitude and spatial extent of this movement? So as I said, magnitude can be from millimeters of movement and looking at the spatial extent of that. And how are the dynamics changing through time? Is an area constantly subsiding? Is an area stable? Or has there been sudden acceleration, for example, following heavy rainfall? And that's likely a trigger for going out and perhaps doing some remediation work. So now I'll focus on a couple of case studies. The first one being on the roads, and in this case it's the M42 near Bromsgrove. And here you can pick out initially this clear subsidence hotspot. It's only about 70 meters in length, and comparatively, you can see the rest of the road is fairly stable. If you look at a time series for that area, it may be only 15 millimeters of settlement. But if you look at the road, an image of the road at this location, you can see that the impact of that displacement is cracking on the road. And in this case, it's likely the differential displacement, which is the cause of the cracking, so between the stable and the moving area. So small amounts of movement can cause damage. In terms of why this movement's occurring, so within SAR, we're just simply saying which areas are moving and which areas are stable. But the UK has a lot of fantastic, freely available, both remote sensing and kind of traditional mapping data sets. For example, the UK National LiDAR and the UK Historic Landfill Database. And just quickly looking at that same location on both of these, we can see that this location historically had several landfills. And in particular, at that exact hotspot is where the M25 crosses one of those landfills. So in this case, it's a clear picture of, okay, we've got movement, we know what's causing it, and perhaps it's just a case that this section of road is always going to have cracking and need some repairs, but it could also be an opportunity to do longer term remediation for this section of road. And again, this is just a very local example, but if you're able to scan the entire network and pick up hotspots like this, you're able to much better prioritize both budgets and how to proactively maintain. For the next example, I'll show a kind of slope stability case. So if there's any kind of geologists or engineering geologists on the call, the Ventnor landslide complex is one of the most famous landslide complexes in the UK. It's on the south of the Isle of Wight. It's commonly known as the Undercliff, and Ventnor and the Undercliff is one of the largest urban areas affected by landslides in Britain. And it's a well-studied area. It's known that it's been moving as far as records go back to the 1800s, and these movements have been continuing to the current day. In fact, while I was waiting for this webinar to start, there's a new article on ground engineering that shows there's been another rockfall in the last 24 hours at this location. So it's really a constant area of movement and closing roads and sometimes people being evacuated from their houses here. This INSAR data, as you can see here, so the red and blue areas are moving. What you can already start to pick out is, for example, where the landslide is bounded, where it's stable and unaffected. For example, on this eastern side, you can see that fairly sharp transition bounded by a fault between the coloured areas and the white dots, and then also to the north and kind of northwest. But it's also a little bit more complicated than that. So if I move to the next slide and we look at a time series for that location, this time series is for the past 10 years. And you can see up until 2023, this area on the top of the landslide was kind of gradually subsiding at around 9 millimeters per year. You can see some seasonal fluctuations in there, but overall a fairly steady linear rate. But in September 23, you see a clear acceleration until kind of mid-2024, with rates increasing to up to 16 millimeters per year. Those of you working on kind of slope stability in the UK might remember that kind of winter 2023, early 2024 was one of the wettest winters in the UK, so one of the wettest in 130 years. And there were several events at Ventnor during that time, the kind of two famous ones being the Bonchurch landslip in December 2023, and this area in St Lawrence in March 2024. If you look at the St Lawrence area, you can clearly see the effect of that movement on the, in the gardens, essentially, of these houses. And if we take a look at what's happening to the houses there, again, you clearly see this acceleration that occurred in 2023, which had stabilized by midway through 2024. And so this type of information is kind of critical for the engineering consultants and ultimately the councils in this area, ideally using this as more of a kind of proactive precursor tool, but also even after an event, is it safe for people to return? Is it safe to reopen the roads? And in this case, we can see that, movement continued well into 2024, but kind of by spring, summer 2024, things appeared to have stabilized. So likely safe to reopen roads. Those of you who have come across INSAR before, and I already touched on it, so vegetation has historically been a limitation at the most common wavelengths. There are a few ways around this, so different satellites that have a longer wavelength, but there is also the opportunity to install what's known as corner reflectors. And these can improve coverage in areas with either kind of low opportunistic data, or also to co-locate these with other ground-based instrumentation. So perhaps co-locate them with GNSS, piezometers to validate the data. And if you see them in the picture, they're at most wavelengths about 1 meter diameter size. They're simply metal triangular trihedral shapes. And these essentially look very bright to the satellite and act as a reliable reflector. So here's an example of some that were installed for Network Rail along one of their embankments. So these are another option when there's not a lot of data, but like any ground-based instrumentation, there's always a risk of, for example, vandalism or them getting stolen. So there's pros and cons of using these. But the good thing about them as well, in terms of, we already touched on things like data sharing, is that corner reflectors can be used by kind of any satellite operator. So this is an example of some corner reflectors that were actually installed while I was at Imperial College London on the M25. And anyone using INSAR satellite radar can see these reflectors and look at data there. So unlike other instrumentation, they're not tied to a data provider. Anyone can essentially use these as data points. So how do engineers apply the network-wide data? So there's two main ways kind of our clients in the UK in the transport sector are using this data on a network scale. So one is guiding inspections, so forward planning where people should be deployed, where should additional analysis occur, and perhaps even where should ground-based instrumentation be installed. INSAR is every 11 or 12 days typically, as I said, in an image, so it's not a replacement for real-time monitoring. But of course, you can't have real-time monitoring generally everywhere, so it can help guide where you want to install that. And ultimately, yeah, proactive asset management. So hopefully identifying precursors and diverting resources for maintenance. An example of this from Network Rail was a failure they had in the southern region in January 2023, when there was a loss of the underlying track support following heavy rainfall. And what we could observe in the INSAR data was actually, movements several years almost prior to this event. But yeah, acceleration in early 2020 that then continued to the point it failed. So sometimes, of course, there can be not much warning, but other times there can be, years of millimeter displacements before things move by meters and cause serious damage. So finally, what's the goal here? It's can we go from reactive maintenance to proactive maintenance? So if we can identify areas with elevated geotechnical risk before they become a problem, and hopefully, yeah, save costs and save damage as well. And with that, I think there's a final poll question that should launch on your screens now. Yep, here we go. So the final poll question is, what applications in the transport sector would you see most benefit to this data? So both having this historical, so a 10-year look back into how an area is moving, and also regularly updated displacement data going forward. So is that slope stability, tunneling, bridges, or network-wide data sets? Thank you very much.
Jennifer, Drew, thanks very much for those presentations. That was really good. Thanks. I don't know, did everybody see the results of the polls come up? The first one was asking if people had used INSAR or not, and that was 24% said yes, 76% said no. Jennifer's second poll there. The majority of people interested in slope stability, and then 24% is in network-wide road and rail. Excellent. Okay, thanks. Right, thanks very much for those introductory talks on the transportation sector. We're going to move on now, and the next presentations are on Earth observation and biodiversity in the property sectors. So that's going to be Ollie Thomas, who is the principal consultant for geospatial and data visualization in Arcadis, and also Madeline Chura, who's consultant ecologist in Arcadis. So just a quick reminder as well, if you have got questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the intro, Ian, and yeah, really interesting. Jennifer, I've not come across that, so yeah, that was a very interesting one. So yeah, so we've come from Arcadis. So Arcadis, we're a global design consultancy, mainly in the kind of the built and nature environment. So I'm Ollie Thomas, so kind of just under 10 years experience in the geospatial industry. So I've worked for kind of various public sector, public government, and last kind of 4 or 5 years in the kind of EIA consultancy sphere. And I'm joined by my colleague, Maddie.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie Chura, and I'm an ecologist at Arcadis. I've been with Arcadis for about 3 years, and I work in the nature advisory sector. So I work a lot on biodiversity net gain, environmental net gain, and also nature strategy as well, where I work very closely with Ollie. So a bit of an overview to start with as to the nature advisory service that we provide, because we're going to be focusing on Earth observation in the biodiversity nature sector today. First of all is the kind of biodiversity baselining, impact dependencies and risk rating. So I work a lot on biodiversity net gain, which is mandatory in the UK, which means that every sort of new development has to show a 10% biodiversity net gain due to statutory law. And so this means it's so important for a lot of clients to understand their baseline, but not only following the kind of statutory guidance, but also just to understand for future development plans what their baseline is, what biodiversity they have. And we'll talk a bit more about that later as well. The second key thing is accessible integrated data. This could be for assessment and insurance. So we live in quite a data-rich world. There's lots of information everywhere, and using geospatial environments to kind of collate this data and pull everything together makes it really accessible, but also makes it really usable for assurance and auditing processes. So having everything kind of all in one place. And then the third key pillar is our visual communication. So a lot of people can visualize much better looking at a map and looking at kind of spatial data rather than looking at an Excel table of information. So this becomes really important when we're talking about things like disclosures, reporting, public engagement, and also within company engagement as well. So Arcadis's approach to building value goes through the whole life cycle of a project or a plan. And at Arcadis, we're lucky that we can actually work through the whole project life cycle for many of our clients. So this starts with at a strategic advisory level, where we're looking at targets. We could be looking at nature objectives, all the way through to feasibility, looking at funding options, site selection, also through to things like estate management. These can be integrated into the design, project-specific interventions. We also look at things like supply chain, and we aim to add value throughout this whole life cycle. And a lot of that is integral to kind of collecting the data and getting that geospatial data. So I'll pass over to Ollie to talk a bit about this.
Thanks, Maddie. Yes, so thought it would just be good to almost kind of pick out a kind of imaginary EIA project and kind of work through the kind of the 5 stages of project lifecycle and kind of where and how we would use geospatial data kind of throughout it. So, I mean, at the initiation, you've obviously got your kind of your baseline kind of data collation part, and really this is the kind of the most important bit. This is where you kind of build your foundations, your kind of your building blocks, getting all the data that you'll later use for the the clever analysis, the figures, the productions, the reports, whatever, building all that data and kind of embedding it into one kind of central location. Preliminary risk assessments. So for a lot of projects, there'll be a kind of a key risk, a key thing that's really important, whether it's to the stakeholder, whether it's to the kind of immediate public. So this could be a particular area of kind of environmental sensitivity. It could be a an old urban area. It could be a particular road. Whatever it is, it's always great to kind of identify that and make it really, really obvious, so no one can not be aware, no one can forget. It'll always be kind of staring in the face. They're kind of typically we call it kind of hard constraints, things that are kind of a no-go. And then next, stakeholder engagement, as Maddie said, it's always crucial, always so important. The most important thing really is having stakeholder buy-in, making sure they're happy, aware of kind of what's going on, because there's no point doing great work if key stakeholders, public, are just kind of completely in the blind about it. So always being engaged and making it really, really easy for them, making kind of really democratic, easily accessible. And that's why kind of a geospatial approach just works wonders, because you can have a kind of a central web map with all that showing, make it available to who needs it, and it's just a great kind of basis to go from. So next would be the planning stage. So this is when you kind of do your environmental impact assessment. So say if we're doing a construction, or if it's kind of like a power project, whatever it is, we can define what the costs are going to be, what are we going to lose, what type of habitats are we going to lose, what's the damage, what's the best way we can mitigate that. And like second one I've done is scenario modeling. So often what we do if it's kind of a cable project, so we need to get from kind of site A to site B, you'd build a kind of a cost matrix of all your constraints, and assign them values. So you have a kind of a lava map type thing, and then you calculate, what's the cheapest way to get from A to B with the lowest cost, and you can then also build in things like kind of slope height, because particularly for cable routes, there's a level where it becomes kind of unsafe and very costly to do. So you can kind of build that all in and create the kind of the cheapest kind of cost to get from there. And then again, and I've said it again, stakeholder communication, making those two points just really clear, really obvious to the client, so they know not only what are the kind of final routes being proposed with the final plans, whatever it is, but also the stages that it could have got there, and that it wasn't just a kind of an arbitrary decision. There's processes, kind of unpersonal, just kind of emotionless database decisions. So next, execution. So when the project's going live. So firstly, change detection. So if assuming we've kind of getting the as-built as they're being kind of generated, we've got the plans of what we think the proposed should be. You can then use whether it's satellites or drones on the site to then get a kind of fairly live dynamic way of kind of comparing, right, where do we think we are to where we are. I've worked on a few construction sites where we've been able to kind of both sense check the as-built and also our drone imagery by kind of comparing the drains, kind of making sure they all line up, within kind of half a centimetre. So yeah, it's really, really valuable, and again, really engaging for the client, because they love to see that, because it's kind of evidence of the process working, and the data to back it up. Next, so we've got field data collection. So yeah, quite a lot of what we'll do at Arcadis is ecologists kind of out in the field, capturing habitat types, condition assessments. And again, if you've kind of got a geospatial kind of CDE, really, really easy to do, and then embed that, into the map. So it's all again in one location. And then the last one, so incident reporting. And again, this can be a crucial one, particularly if you're on a really big project with different companies, kind of different levels of technical kind of expertise, some people who may be on the site every day, some people who maybe have never been on the site. Having a kind of centralized mapping location where, there's dots on the map, embedded photos, so it's clear kind of what's going on, who's doing what, who's actioning it, what's the deadline, when's it going to be sorted by, etc., etc. Next, so again, with it being all spatial, it allows it to be really easy monitored, kind of similar to the change detection, but also you can kind of embed in dashboards and just make it quite nice, quite clear, kind of what's going on. And then lastly, so we've got the kind of the final as-bit data. So this can be a really, really, really valuable data set to kind of hand over to the client once it's finished. Kind of legacy, whether it's legacy kind of power cables, water cables, stuff like that, which they might not inherently know, they might not inherently need, but in 20 years' time, when they're kind of redeveloping their site, they will be very thankful that they don't have to hire someone like us to dig a load of boreholes around their site, because they'll know what they're dealing with. Knowledge management. So yeah, as long as the kind of data structure is in good order, it should be good to kind of hand over, whether that's kind of the legacy data store or directly to the client, public, whatever it needs to be. And then we've got the legacy monitoring. So with the data being live and kind of with a healthy life cycle, you can kind of keep the monitoring going, for years, decades, whatever it needs to be. So what data is available? So I've kind of listed there a few of the kind of key hitters that we probably kind of use on a kind of standard EIA project. Again, as kind of other speakers have said, I mean, UK, we're very fortunate. It's a very kind of data rich environment, particularly the last kind of 4 or 5 years. There's really loads out there, and it's really easy to kind of pull the data from the direct API feed. So, you don't have to kind of download data and have it like locally stored. You can pull it straight from source. Globally, it's a bit more kind of hit and miss. There's some sites that are really good. So like America, Australia, very, very good. EU kind of depends a bit more, but like Far East China it is often a bit more kind of slim pickings. So yeah, you've kind of just got to be aware of that, and particularly if you're working on global projects, you might have to get a bit more creative with things kind of like OpenStreetMap, or to kind of relying more on remote sensing data. So data challenges, thought I'd just kind of list out the key kind of data challenges that we normally come across. So firstly, and most unsurprisingly, data quality. So errors in the data, gaps, typos, whatever it is. I think GIS data, it's still kind of slightly catching up, kind of the textual kind of quality. So often, yeah, there'll be holes. So you even need to kind of be aware of that. Build kind of checks in. Standardization interoperability. Yeah. So this is around, again, making sure that all the kind of data syncs in correctly, because often if you get a kind of a national data set, it might actually be formed of loads of kind of sub local authorities, or sub governments who kind of feed that in. So while it might look like one kind of happy kind of product on the output, if you kind of dig under, it might be a little bit more hit and miss. And then there's the issue with kind of formats. There's loads of different GIS formats out there, and that could be a bit of a barrier to entry, because you might need to know kind of what software, what tool you need for the job. And then particularly if you're working on a global perspective, there's the coordinate system issue. So if it's just British kind of data sets you're dealing with, you can just use the British National Grid. That'll be nice and easy. But if you're on a kind of more global or kind of sub-region, subcontinent, all different types of coordinate systems out there, and you can quite easily kind of get yourself into a bit of a muddle. Resolution scale, again, global data sets will generally have a trade-off with quality, or if not, then it will be the size of the file, and then you need to have the capacity infrastructure to deal with that. Paywall, so particularly on a global front, a lot of data sets are locked behind a paywall, and kind of domestically OS master map, which is often a great kind of foundational data set to use, again locked behind a paywall. So it's just something to bear in mind, and kind of linked to the big data management as well. A lot of GIS, a lot of remote sensing, the data sets are really, really big. So yeah, you need the software and hardware in order to be able to run that. This was going to be a video, but you'll just have to use your imaginations. So this is a kind of classic, quite simple GIS kind of CD web map that we might use for a project. So it's built using Esri web app. So if anyone's kind of familiar with Esri, it'll probably be quite similar to kind of look at. And yeah, just kind of down the bottom there, we'd have all the widgets that would kind of contain all your kind of subject matter data. Top right, then you've kind of got some kind of classic widgets, whether that's measure, kind of create a figure, do some kind of basic analysis, and then at the top you'll have a way of kind of searching for site-specific elements. So yeah, they're just really easy to use, and we find they're really popular with kind of all the clients, because yeah, very, very simple, very effective. The last thing I'd like to touch on, so around the BNG, yeah, we've been doing a lot of work on kind of improving our process kind of around this. So as Maddie said, any new development, you need now a minimum of 10% net gain. So if you lose, a hectare of grass, you have to replace it with, the same amount plus 10% worth of kind of habitat score. And yeah, we just found, again, kind of making this digital, really using geospatial data is just really, really effective for BNG, kind of for all the 4 stages. So the baselining, again, you can capture it. You can kind of see on a map the habitats, the planning and design. So if you're creating new sites and kind of working out the costs, you can almost kind of on the fly, plan A, get a cost, plan B, get a cost. The compensation stage, so a thing that's often quite common is developers won't be able to get the gain on their site, so they'll do what's called offsite compensation. And this kind of historically has maybe been a bit kind of then thrown away and forgotten about, but so it's been a bit more kind of queried now. But again, if you've kind of got it spatial, you could just have, an on-site dashboard and an off-site dashboard, link them all together, and it would just be very nice, all in one place, easy to understand. And then lastly, monitoring, reporting. Again, it being in a dashboard, the data being refreshed, you could have multiple phases, multiple sites. It just means then the developer has all the information they need just in one central location. So that's me, and I'll hand over to Maddie now.
Thanks, Ollie. So I want to talk a bit about the why now, why we care about doing this biodiversity net gain. Yes, it's kind of a statutory requirement in the UK, but that's not kind of our only driver. And actually, one clear driver is this planetary boundaries idea, where there's 9 planetary boundaries, which are processes which are regulating kind of the resilience of Earth's ecosystems. And when we talk about crossing a boundary, that's just talking about the increased risk of sort of irreversible environmental change. So a recent planetary health check shows that possibly 6, maybe even 7 of these 9 boundaries have already been breached as of 2023. And so there's kind of a clear trend towards future pressure on this. And for example, if you pick one of the boundaries, which is novel entities, which is things like PFAS and microplastics, previously that was not really on the radar, but actually in 2023 we can see that's very much on the radar. So even sort of ignoring our local statutory drivers, we have this kind of massive main driver of the health of our planet. And the second driver, oh, if you go back one, sorry, yeah. The second main driver is kind of our global target for restoring biodiversity, which is at the moment to restore it by 2050. This kind of shows us 3 different pictures. Our business as usual is quite a bleak picture, so we actually do need to maximise the opportunities to deliver biodiversity and environmental net gain and try to restore these systems. So we need a kind of change in how our consumption is, our sort of sustainable living. We need a big change with that. And just talk a bit about the economics as well. So the World Economic Forum estimates we need to triple investment in nature by 2030. And at COP29, there was an agreement reached for, I think, around 300 billion annually by 2035. So we've got these kind of big global drivers for biodiversity. Next slide. Then our Arcadis, the kind of Arcadis business case for nature, we have these multiple drivers. So some of them regulatory, some of them reputational, some of them kind of targets, global targets. And we also have challenges, but we do also have the opportunities. So by facilitating the business case for nature, we're trying to pull these all together to get these good outcomes, get kind of the business case in some cases. And more we have clients that are considering TNFD. So this is just one framework. There's lots of kind of frameworks out there that are kind of emerging, that are looking to encourage businesses to look at their entire operations. So not just their physical footprint, but kind of looking back to the supply chain, looking at what their impacts are on nature and their dependencies as well. So TNFD, as an example, has these kind of 4 pillars. So the governance, the strategy, risk and impact management, metrics and targets. And by taking companies through this journey, we try to get these kind of good outcomes and get them the nature strategy. Next slide, please. So as an example of a portfolio assessment, to focus in, we would look at the impact and risk column of the TNFD, for example, and look at a portfolio and come up with a kind of risk rating. This is where our geospatial data becomes really important. We look at the magnitude, the sensitivity and the likelihood. So the magnitude being the kind of operations that are actually happening at the site. So for example, if you've just got an office block, that's possibly a lower impact than, for example, a factory, so what operations are going on. We also look at the sensitivity, so this is where the geospatial data sets are really important, so what protected sites are not only within the boundary of the area, but also within proximity, but also connected, might be hydrologically connected, for example. So some examples of receptors that we might look at is protected sites in the UK, like SSSIs, SACs, Ramsar sites, local nature reserves, ancient woodland, things like that. And then we also look at the likelihood. So the likelihood being the proximity, the pathway. So it could be just physical distance, which we can use our sort of geospatial maps for, but we also look at pathways as well. So it could be a river connected. It could be a hedgerow, some linear pathway that connects our site to this sensitive receptor. And that gives us a kind of overall risk rating, taking into account those three factors. And using our geospatial data, we can analyze and interpret this and have everything kind of collated in one place as well. Next slide. So as a bit of a case study, and this is in the property sector, so we did some work with Savills on their portfolio, on their sort of TNFD journey. We looked at their assets and combined aerials with habitat mapping, some remotely sensed data, and a lot of those data sets, which Ollie talked about earlier, we kind of got a database together to look at what their portfolio was looking like and do some risk ratings for their sites. So this is an example of one of their sites, which was a fitness club with a car park, and looking from the aerials, we looked at some of the habitat mapping, and we also looked at the kind of site location. Was it connected to any sort of sensitive receptors? Has it got some designated sites within really close proximity? How far away are they? We also looked at the climate risk rating as well. We integrated that data to kind of get a final ranking of the site. So in this case, it was in proximity to a designated watercourse, which then had connectivity to a SAC, a special area of conservation, which supported things like the crayfish. So we were looking at potential pathways, for example, surface water runoff, direct pollution, recreational pressure, things like that. So this kind of all fed in to the impact rating for this site. The next stage is to then look at the potential opportunities and enhancements, and you kind of use the information you've gathered in the first stage to come up with kind of targeted approaches. So, for example, focusing on specific species that are in the area that you could improve. In this example, we've got things like bat and bird boxes, improving suds in the car park, which could reduce the runoff into that sensitive river receptor, looking at kind of charity days and collaborations, as it's a kind of gym fitness centre, looking at getting employees or visitors involved in kind of pollinator gardens, things like that. And following on from this, we would then look at kind of targets and metrics. So this is a kind of quite a generic summary of targets, and this comes from a piece that Arcadis led on the Green Construction Board roadmap, which you can actually is freely downloadable and gives some really nice information. These kind of targets or science-based targets are often the next step, where you want to understand what your baseline is, what your assets are, and then think about what is feasible and achievable for your nature targets. So these are just some examples, looking at drivers and funding, looking at actual measurement, management and monitoring, which is where our things like our BNG dashboard would come in, using our geospatial data to monitor that. And also not forgetting the kind of upskilling and engagement sessions, which again, having really clear visuals is so important to kind of translating this message across, and upskilling and engagement can be really important with this. Next slide. So some considerations that you have when you're looking at enhancements. Challenges for leaseholders, so whether you actually have control of your assets, the site land or not, will determine what you can do with it. But there are lots of options. Even if you can't physically change it, you can still do the community upskilling and the engagement sessions. And this leads to the importance of kind of initiatives and embedding that into the kind of mindset. There's also with BNG, there's the commitment to managing the habitat for 30 years. So considerations need to be taken for that as well. You want to consider taking your baseline nice and early, because possible future development, you want to be able to demonstrate that baseline. You also need to look at the feasibility of target setting as well, and making sure that your enhancements are actually aligning with the site usage. So this comes down to the kind of site specificity, and also what's technically feasible. So can they support a green wall or a green roof? Is it going to be possible? And then considering the engagement with local groups, again, making sure you're thinking about the community, the small picture as well as the big picture. And that links to flexibility of use as well, as things might change. So kind of bringing it back to our kind of this idea of this nature positive journey, we're looking at where are our assets. So lessons learned, a lot of the kind of fact finding when we come to these nature journeys is looking at where the assets actually are. And this geospatial database is so important for this step in the journey. So looking at what's there already, existing asset management databases, there's so much data out there, particularly for the UK. So pulling this data together is really important. The messaging, again, just to reiterate that it's so important to make it accessible, and so that people can understand what message you're trying to put across. And we find things like the smart atlases are a really nice way to do that, because people like looking at maps, they like being able to see spatially where things are. And it's just about starting people on this journey and kind of trying to facilitate that collaboration and relationship building. We suggest things like biodiversity champions because, as said here, little knowledge can spark big changes. We had an anecdote recently of a client who by chance was on a site and was speaking to someone in the local area about nature. They happened to be involved in the local nature reserve, and that led to now a possible collaboration between them, which wouldn't have necessarily been on the radar before. So just having those conversations can be really important. And that can lead to wider knowledge shares. And also thinking about the supply chain as well. So not just kind of the physical assets at the moment, but also where the supply chain is coming from. And that leads to annual disclosure as well. So, which I think, yeah, so on our last slide, so with our kind of disclosure, it might be the TNFD, it might be another framework. We look at the full picture. So integrated spatial data management is kind of at the core. We want that collaborative approach. We want the engagement, and we want the stakeholder engagement to get the good outcomes. And this can lead to evidence-based target setting, effective communication, and visual literacy as well. So we always find it's a journey, and a big part of that journey is using the geospatial data and the database.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ollie, Madeline. That was really interesting, I must say. That was brilliant. Okay, we are going to move on to the Q&A session now. So I would ask all the speakers if they could turn on their microphones, webcams again. And we've received some questions, but there is still time. So if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free. If you could put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that helps us keep track of them. There's also the option to put thumbs up if you like any of the questions that have been asked. And just so we can prioritize them a bit. Okay. Right, I'm going to ask the first question, and I'm going to keep it on the environmental theme, so it's more for Ollie and Madeline. So the first question from Eric Morgan. We understand that 2/3 of biodiversity resides in the soils. So how can we use geospatial techniques to use, how can they be used to understand the baseline and monitor better?
So I can talk a bit about biodiversity net gain and how we measure that. So
Sure.
In the UK, when we measure biodiversity net gain using the kind of statutory metric tool, we assess it based on habitats. So the kind of soil biodiversity will be included within that kind of assessment based on the habitat itself. So when we're using our geospatial techniques, we're using it to kind of identify the habitats that are present. So that kind of half answers the question in the sense that it's included within that. Other data sets that we do use to look at soils, things like soilscapes, which we can integrate into our map, so we can take that into account, looking at kind of the soil type, which gives an idea of kind of what biodiversity value it might have. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Sure, no, that's good, thanks. Ollie, have you got anything you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, as Maddie said, it's kind of included in the B&G assessment, but I mean, aware there's a few kind of remote sensing techniques, methodologies you can use to kind of analyze the health of the soil. So I think it's, just quickly Google, soil moisture monitoring. So I think you can use that kind of with Sentinel-1, and you can kind of analyze the, roughly the moisture, and then, inferring hopefully the kind of the health and the kind of biodiversity of the soil. But yeah, for B&G, yeah, we don't really do anything with the remote sensing. But yeah, there is some stuff you could do out there, definitely, and it's a very valid point, and it's probably a bit of an oversight in the current methodology, and it's definitely a kind of a work in progress with the B&G. I think they've changed it a few times, kind of with catching up with actually what really matters.
Sure. No, that's really interesting. Thanks. Okay, so also another question from Eric, and I think it's probably more to Jennifer. So he was asking, how does SatSense compare with the European Ground Motion Service?
Yeah, sure. So for those who don't know what the European Ground Motion Service is, it's a INSAR map of Europe, run by a consortium, and you can go online and take a look at that. And it's a great tool for kind of discovery, seeing what INSAR data looks like, and kind of getting familiar with it. In terms of kind of actively using it in projects, one limitation is that it's essentially always out of date. So the current data set is from 2019 to December 2023, so over a year or so out of date. So yeah, it's great for having a quick look back in time, but it's not continuously updated, and that's what SatSense and other INSAR providers do. And when you're looking for things like acceleration precursors to a failure, you can't be looking at a data set that's over a year out of date. And then there's all the other things like derived analytics and integration with existing tools that providers would do that you can't do with EGMS.
Brilliant. No, that's really useful. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to jump to another question actually for Drew that came up elsewhere. So Drew, I wonder if you could say something about how the relationship between sort of legacy hard systems and commercial and public innovation and Earth monitoring development.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, just even listening to there's definitely huge developments taking place right now, and a lot of pilots being taken forward. I mean, one example, organizations are looking at the data that they currently gather based on monitoring systems on the ground for legacy purposes. new sources of data that are becoming available, like satellite data, TomTom, Google. There are a range of providers in the transport sector looking at transport movements, integrated transport, and trying to commercialize that, quite rightly, as a business. But some of that data is publicly available as well. But one of the richer streams of data that we're thinking about are in-vehicle data and vehicle-to-road data systems. And there's a range of pilots taken forward, linked to Europe, I think in Ireland, looking at how information from vehicles could be gathered and collected at the roadside and perhaps send information back to the road user in some way that will allow them to have a better journey. And there's a really good, I quite like the Mapscaping podcast. There's a really good podcast. The last one looked at telematics and information that comes from transport and how that's used to manage journeys. And one suggestion, I'm not suggesting that anybody would be doing this, but one suggestion that's thought about was thought are the positive incentives that can be provided to road users to reward them for traveling in a more sustainable or a better way, or something that would add value to encourage and lock in that more sustainable behavior. But the other one, maybe just last point to mention in relation to maturation of this industry, is the build it or buy it question. Do all of various stakeholders or those infrastructure owners, do they build that system based on skills that they have, data that they can collect, data that is mission critical, and collate it with other data to build a system that looks at maybe net gain or carbon, or are the systems available off the shelf and could it be tuned as a product for the user? There's two things I think driving the industry, or a range of things, but maybe the two things I'm talking about right now are, what are these new sets of Earth observation information and how can be used in the sector? And the other one is, how do the infrastructure owners blend that? Do they develop skills internally so that they can do that, or do they work with other stakeholders to purchase services off the shelf and embed that in their existing systems?
Yeah, no, I mean that's really interesting. I work in the Welsh Government and Transportation Department, and it's the same issues that we're grappling with as well. I have to say, just in terms of staffing resource and probably skills as well, that we personally are going to be kind of like outsourcing, so looking for the buy-in expertise, speaking to people like Jennifer, and our friends at Arcadis, they're the people that have got the specialist knowledge. I find.
One of the things we've been some organisations are thinking about, is there a halfway house, and what is the hands-on in relation to developing those tools? So how is the shaping of that shaping an external product that's provided for the organisation managed? Do we take ownership of the storyboarding and the crafting, or is all of that handed over and there's just one sheet of paper explaining what the outputs are, and then the whole thing nests together? Sorry.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, right. I'm going to jump back to some of the questions that came in from the chat, and the next one was an anonymous attendee. We don't mind if you say, or if you're anonymous. But it was about, how are you using Earth observation to support BNG dashboard and calculation? So that's, I guess, is for Madeline and Ollie. Really?
So for probably the kind of historic way we would have captured the kind of the habitat data that underlies the BNG would have been some ecologists going out on site and kind of manually capturing the data. But what we're now kind of transitioning more to is having a kind of an automated way to kind of pre-populate that habitat data. So it's partly being done through the various vector layers that are available. As I said earlier, like UK, we're very lucky that there's quite a bit that you can just kind of pull freely. And then the one paid layer we use is Mastermap, and we found with that we can get a pretty good kind of guesstimate of what habitats are going to be there. We've been using that for some massive projects where it would have cost loads and taken loads of time to get an ecologist out. And then what we're now kind of kind of really currently in the process of doing is playing around with remote sensing techniques and finding kind of what kind of works best, what kind of improves upon what we've got already. Specifically from a B&G point of view, hedgerows need to be captured as lines. So that's one of the things we're kind of particularly focusing on, and we're currently kind of playing around with a technique that's basically using a DSM and a DTM and kind of dropping out. And we found that's a really good way of identifying hedgerows and kind of trees and canopies and stuff like that. And then from there, we can infer the kind of the hedgerow lines and the tree locations. But yeah, we're still kind of playing around with and finding out kind of what we think best. But it's definitely something we will be exploring, because if we the hope is to kind of have a kind of a solution that we can apply kind of worldwide. And worldwide, we can't rely on the good UK data sets. So then, yeah, that will be kind of almost entirely a remote sensing kind of solution where we'll be able to infer it in.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Madeline, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add to what Ollie's saying is a lot of, with the kind of statutory BNG, we do have the kind of ecologist surveys, but having the Earth observation data to kind of give us an idea before we go out can be really valuable. And it kind of getting that baseline habitat is what the Earth observation data it has been useful for. And then, as Ollie says, sort of scaling it up, it can provide kind of information before the ecologist has gone out, which can help them when they do go out. And then from our point of view, scaling it up to global as well, where we don't have necessarily the kind of level of data that we do in the UK, it can be really useful to have those remotely sensed data sets as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you know, I've actually got a follow-up question of my own, really, to really, one of the, in the slides that you were talking about, you mentioned as-built data at the end. I was wondering if you could say anything about what sort of issues there might be about passing as-built data on to clients. And I only ask because I'm a client and I have a lot of problems with that. So I don't know if...
So that was when I worked at DiverSpeed, that was really, really crucial for, I won't say which site, but a project where we were effectively kind of knocking down a site and rebuilding it. And a huge issue they had is they'd been loads of work on the site, but they had no idea where any of the utilities pipeline cables were. There were loads of instances of them trusting their legacy data and them striking pipes, striking cables. So it was a really, really high cost, both financially and also, risk of life. So we kind of came over and started kind of taking control of the kind of the BIM phases and stuff like that. And a really key thing that the client were interested in, so we really focused it on, was really, really accurate, kind of up to date as-built information, kind of as and when live. So we'd update it every week, and they would have a live dashboard where it would be, we would fly a drone, I think it was every monthly roughly, and then they'd have the latest as-built, so they could literally, drive around on a map and kind of confirm, check that what we're saying is actually there. When there was a ISO metadata standard that I can't recall off the top of my head, but we were using that again to rate all the kind of CAD data we had about how accurate we were, and it was just a really important thing to the client. And technically it can be done. It's just about kind of enforcing the standards and making sure it's all been done right, really.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I fully support that as well. Yeah, I feel so often that when we talk about as-built information, I get a PDF. That's my as-built. As a client, I always feel like I failed if I task somebody to do something and their end product is a PDF. I've not asked the right question. Is what I feel like. Thanks for that. Okay, on with the next question. The next question was one for Jennifer, and before I've just skipped past it, it was, so when assessing miles and miles worth of assets and proactively looking for movement, which could be anywhere, do you use any particular software or AI to interpret the data? Also, is the movement per year an average of several years together, or can you see if there are patterns of things speeding up? So it's two-part question there. So do you want to talk about software AI interpretation first?
Yeah, sure. So definitely these days we have to use kind of machine learning and AI techniques to be able to scan entire networks. INSAR data is fairly heavy on the data side. So we, for example, if you take a tunneling project through London and you want to identify all the buildings that have been affected by that tunneling, we've used various kind of machine learning clustering techniques to be able to detect which buildings have been affected, also at which time, and looking for patterns in that data. We also use a number of different kind of risk metrics and thresholds. So for example, in terms of looking for when an area has exceeded a threshold, that threshold is typically determined by the client, as the clients know their assets best and what's acceptable. And we have it set up so, if it exceeds, say, 30 millimeters of displacement, that can either be an alert via email or an alert in their dashboard, or various things like that. So there's a lot of different kind of thresholding and analytics you can use on this data to make it more automated. In terms of software, we're pretty flexible. So we find particularly, large clients all have your own GIS set up with LiDAR or other kind of CAD data in it. And, INSAR can be treated as another data layer to bring into that. And as I think I showed through those case studies, INSAR is just one part of the story. You then want to look at the LiDAR and other data sets to understand that. So, we have APIs to bring into whether it's Esri software or another commercial package. And of course, we also have our own portal for that. In terms of if the movement is average of several years or patterns, so at SatSense, we have it updating every time an image is acquired by the satellite. So within a day of that acquisition. So, you can look back 10 years, but you're really looking at, every incremental displacement over that period and going forward. So you can see if things are accelerating and compare that. It's always important still to look back. Is that acceleration perhaps part of a shrink swell sinusoidal curve, or is it actually that it's been stable for 10 years and suddenly started moving? And so we also use that kind of thing in our alerting and thresholds as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's good. And so, I mean, how would you go about then implementing an alerting system for monitoring a whole network then? What's the setup for that?
Yeah, so we would probably have a few different risk thresholds. So one would be, for example, cumulative displacement. Another would be acceleration. So if there's a significant change in trend compared to usually the past 1 or 2 years, is used for that. And then, depending on, for example, for structures, we do different things as well using that. Yeah, because they often have a lot more movements occurring. So again, it's just all different kind of mathematical functions essentially, and a lot of the setup for a network wide is testing that on historical data. Which of these thresholds actually best matches what's happened in the past.
No, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I just had another question for Drew, actually, just perhaps expanding on what he said earlier in his speech. I was wondering if you could possibly say a bit more about how we can improve sharing of data, from a client perspective.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a developing area that it's a lot of the partners I'm aware of, not even within Transport Scotland, but organisations that have infrastructure that are working together on joint problems, share data or have data held internally within the systems and asset management systems, and would probably, do make information publicly available that's standard, clean, simple, straightforward data. And there was a list of that information on one of the presentations. However, there's a whole range of other deeper analytical information or trial or innovation data that is could be developed in models, and I'm aware that infrastructure owners are working in partnership with others. Flooding, for example, working with environmental organizations to look at more detailed flooding analysis in areas where there's a vulnerability and risk. But what is that space where those owners can work together, sharing that information that might be sensitive, it might not be clean, it might not be 100% accurate, but it's good enough for the purposes that it's been used for. What is that sandbox space that could and organizations can work collaboratively in? And the challenge there in some of the projects I've been involved in is where is that shared space that would allow a whole range of different tools to be used, different types of software and data, how are those models built, how can you work together on creating something? And there's been a few instances recently where I've picked up the feeling that maybe that space could be created. Who leads on it? How is the data held secure? Is it academia? Is it third-party organizations? And there's some examples like the Credo and Daphne project where I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but it's led by Innovation UK, I think, and anybody can sign up to it and put data in there and work on models that relate to climate change and sustainability and developing adaptation pathways. However, other organizations have proposed creating similar things. Challenge is it's quite expensive to develop that. You need computing power. Where does it sit? Has it got push-pull, or is it simply a storage area? How is it managed? And these are things that are under development, but I think developing a crucible where information could be shared in a way that allows Earth observation data to be used usefully and point towards policy or shape up adaptation pathways or develop solutions would be a really useful thing to develop. And I don't know if that's something that CIRIA and others have thought about, at least tracking that and being part of that in some way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it sounds fascinating. Talk to Jack. I'm sure Jack and CIRIA would be really interested in thinking about that a bit more if they're not already. Okay, I'm actually going to another question for Ollie and Madeline. Really, I was wondering if you could say something about the key advantages and disadvantages of using sort of open source GIS software compared to using sort of paid GIS solutions, and how would you advise an organization which option best suits their needs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting kind of quite a dynamic space, really. The kind of paid versus free, and I mean, particularly from a kind of desktop GIS. So QGIS, which is the open source software, has really come on kind of leaps and bounds, and has a kind of fantastic support community, and there's constant kind of innovation going on there. So almost probably from a kind of digital innovation, I just think the kind of crowd solution will probably trump really kind of Esri's more kind of official kind of corporate approach. Now, I mean, being an Arcadis, so we are kind of, if you asked our kind of IT, we would say we're a kind of an Esri based GIS company, and that would be the kind of the corporate solution, you know, with ArcGIS Pro and, you know, all the smart apps as we've shown is all on kind of Esri kind of infrastructure. But there definitely is also a kind of an undercurrent of QGIS, and mainly because it's really quite powerful what it can do. It's obviously got its limitations, and there's, you know, I think when dealing with you know, CAD and kind of big data, that's probably when the kind of the more paid for solutions, whether it's, you know, AutoCAD DWG or kind of FME, those kind of tools do kind of maybe come into their own. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear kind of what Drew, if he doesn't mind, put me on the start, what his thoughts are on this as well.
For me, one of the benefits of Esri is, I mean, yeah, they've both got pros and cons. I've seen various tables listing the pros and cons of Esri and QGIS, and yeah, I think they are compatible. One's better than the other in slightly different areas. One of the benefits of Esri, perhaps, is, but also perhaps one of the limitations is, I quite like the storyboarding and It's corporate. It's got a storage area, so it's linked to that. It's quite expensive, but it seems to be a wee bit more closed for me in terms of a lot of the data that's publicly available is you can pull it into QGIS and you can immediately see it. Whereas if you create a model, I've seen some of it's maybe just the way things are managed in Esri. Some of the data doesn't seem to be directly downloadable from some of the projects. But I notice when you link in, then there's a download so you can pull it forward. But yeah, but I think whatever tools used, it's developing that kind of collaborative space between everybody that's involved in managing the data and developing a product, be it commercial or public sector, but working together with tools that integrate well with each other, I think is the challenge.
No, I would agree with that. I think there's also a lot to be said for just trying to explain what is possible to a client. And I say that as a client who I'm not particularly tech savvy, to be honest. I work with a lot of people who are, and if they get an opportunity to actually explain what's done, I'm quite often just surprised, basically, what is possible. That's my own ignorance. That's because I can't even work my own smart TV, to be honest. So if you get a chance, it is worth explaining to people what's possible. Okay, next question. There was one from Tom Kettle, and it was a question for Jennifer. So, are there limitations on INSAR with regards vegetation cover, or what other factors that will give you less visible data sets and affect displacement measuring?
Yeah, so the kind of success of INSAR in vegetated areas depends on the wavelength that you use. So the European Space Agency Sentinel-1 operates at what's called a C-band wavelength. That's about 5 centimeters, and essentially the data gets scattered off, leaves of trees, or if there's agricultural fields being ploughed, you're essentially changing the surface properties, and we lose data. There are longer wavelength satellites that operate at what's called L-band that can penetrate the vegetation canopy. At the moment, the only L-band satellites are commercial, which means you're paying several hundred, if not more, pounds per image, which obviously drives up the cost of a project. But there are, is hopefully this month, a L-band satellite where the data will be freely available being launched. So we expect that to kind of revolutionize INSAR monitoring for vegetated slopes, because historically that has always been a huge limitation. And of course, in the UK, there are a lot of vegetated slopes. So that should hopefully change soon, and we'll have much better coverage. The other thing that affects data is in a similar sense, but if there's been, for example, a lot of construction, and again, disturbing the surface signal, if we're tracking how things move by millimeters over time, and then, for example, you dump a load of soil on an embankment, that of course changes the surface by potentially meters. Again, there are ways around that in terms of processing, but historically that would say destroy the signal for a few months at least while construction is ongoing, and then you might pick up a stable signal again in the future.
No, thanks. That helps a lot. Yeah, I'm really interested in what develops and what comes in the next few months, I must say.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Okay, I might go back to Ollie and Madeline. I was wondering if you could maybe say something about how you think sort of remote sensing can be effectively integrated with supporting other environmental monitoring on decision-making processes that you're involved in on a scheme.
Nice. I can take that one. So yeah, I mean, I won't talk about the kind of the BNG point because we kind of discussed that earlier. But for a project we're doing out in India, which is around kind of nature recovery, so trying to encourage healthier kind of agricultural practices and just the landscape being kind of looked after better. What we actually used was just the freely available Sentinel-2, and on the infrared band, which I believe is 5 meters or 10 meters. I think it might be 10 meters. But what we were then able to do is normalize different vegetation index, so NDVI, which is, I mean, just in case no one isn't aware, it's a way of kind of effectively kind of assessing how green, how kind of healthy, how kind of organic the habitats, the kind of the flora is there. And the advantage of Sentinel 2 is we could there's a real kind of back catalogue of the stuff that's available, so we were able to kind of track back to when the scheme had first started, which I think was around kind of 2015, and then kind of compare to what it is now, and yeah, see just some of the kind of early successes in the schemes, because yeah, a lot of the sites were just kind of visibly kind of greener. So obviously kind of issues with the accuracy, you know, you won't be getting kind of small shrubs, trees, and yada yada yada, you know, bits like that. But from a kind of quick and easy, completely free thing to do, it was a quite an effective way of proving, because we've been told this, but it was a bit of a blind spot, and I think upper management were a bit nervous that schemes might not actually be being kind of carried out in a proper way. But yeah, a really quick, easy way of kind of proving that process had worked.
Good. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, there is still a couple of questions in the question box at the moment. Although one of them's more of a point. Shiva points out about the as-built information, and I was saying just point out how much it costs to actually identify and determine so as-built data. I completely agree with you there. There is another question for Jennifer, really. So Adam Branson, thanks for the question. So is realizing the INSAR frequency of repeat sampling is restricted by satellite orbit times. Do you know if there's any plan to increase satellite coverage to reduce sampling interval?
Yes, there is. So at the moment, with the kind of what I would call the big legacy satellites, so whether that's Sentinel or the Airbus TerraSat X, or for the constellation called Cosmos SkyMed, you can go to 4 or 6 day repeats in a lot of Europe, certainly. There are a lot of what's called small satellites being launched into lower orbits. Companies like Capella, iSight, Inspective are the ones you might come across. But at the moment, and honestly for kind of years now, they've not had good enough orbital control for INSAR. So they have daily revisit times, and you can use the SAR data for things like flood mapping, but you can't use it for INSAR. So we've been waiting for this to have come down to daily revisit times, and it should do. But to be blunt, ultimately these companies are being funded by defence at the moment, so the priority is not having the orbits for INSAR. But I do expect within the next year or two we should have daily revisit times for INSAR.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Okay, while you're still on there, I was wondering, just to avoid any confusion, could you talk about the benefits? Actually, it's about the benefits of INSAR compared to something like LiDAR, and I wonder if you want to just quickly explain the difference.
Yes, so they both work very complementary together. So LiDAR, you're typically using it for a digital elevation model or digital terrain model, kind of that 3D surface of your site. And you can do differencing between LiDAR surveys, so perhaps a year spaced apart, for example. And those you can typically measure kind of change of the surface with centimeter resolution. That's the most common. But with INSAR, you're really looking at millimeter displacements. You're not kind of making a digital terrain model. You're looking at how that site has moved by millimeters, and over whether that's daily or weekly time periods. So you wouldn't say be able to identify acceleration of a landslide with LiDAR. You could map the landslide quite effectively. And what's often really nice in those slope stability cases is overlaying the INSAR data with the LiDAR data, and you can pick out how different blocks of that landslide mapped with LiDAR are moving from the INSAR data. So yeah, together they work really nicely, but they're not a replacement of one another.
Yeah, fair enough. No, I mean that's it. That's the whole idea, isn't it? It's integrated what the EO data can get, and it's complementary to all these other data sets that are out there. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, there is another question. I think it's probably going to go back to Madeline and Ollie. It's from Claire Dixon, and it looks like quite a detailed question. That's why I like doing CIRIA events. You get better quality of question here, I must say. Right. Given the part that soils play in life on Earth, it does seem an oversight that it is not included in the BNG. There are over 700 different types of soil in the UK naturally occurring. Constructions tend to have limited soil types that they provide and often do not appreciate the value of soils or even baseline properly before starting. Soil moisture is an important metric in preventing overcompaction of soil. I'm sorry, I've just skipped on too far. Is this remote sensing metric that is being at all used in construction? Do you know? So, remote sensing metric for soil moisture.
I can talk a bit about this. So completely agree with Carl's point that the importance of soils, and while it's not included in the kind of UK statutory BNG metric, as I mentioned before, it's kind of assumed that based on the habitat, that's kind of taken into account the soil that's going to be below that habitat, in a sense, but it should, and often we're promoting for it to be considered kind of separately in a lot of projects. So we have a really great soils team at Arcadis that do a lot of work in this, and definitely look at kind of the soil moisture and looking at kind of using these remote sensing databases. So I'm not actually part of the soils team, but we do work in close collaboration with them. And I know that this is something that they do promote a lot and use for their kind of projects as well.
Brilliant.
Again, not a soil expert, but yeah, I think the advantage of working at a company Arcadis is, yeah, we do have a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, and as we said, because we've got a kind of dedicated soil team, often what we'll do is when we're kind of putting forward the best solution, we will be inferring with soil experts, so like it'll be taken into account. But I mean, Claire, yeah, again, completely agree. It is it's quite poor that it's not kind of statutory, not kind of statutory requirement. It might, I mean, it being a kind of a national rule set, it will always have kind of oversights and slight loopholes, and it will undervalue some things and overvalue some, other things, and there'll be kind of regional issues. But yeah, no, completely agree.
Brilliant. Okay, right. Thanks for that. Okay, I think we've probably reached the end of the questions that we have. I just while we're there, actually, is any of the panelists who are up here at the moment, is there anything else that you haven't brought up so far that you just like to mention now? If not, don't worry, because I think we covered an awful lot there. Sorry,
maybe I can actually mention something about soil moisture as well. So again, I'm very much not a soils expert, but in kind of my field of remote sensing, so the SAR data that I'm talking about for INSAR can also be used for soil moisture. So the common one I think Ollie already alluded to is using multispectral data from Sentinel-2 or other satellites. But that of course has the standard limitation of clouds affecting the signal, and also the land cover can influence the soil moisture signal as well. Whereas radar of course has the advantage of penetrating clouds. And that L band I was talking about in terms of penetrating vegetation for INSAR can do the same for soil moisture, and it's a different component of the radar data, but that can be used for soil moisture as well. But it's not, specifically quantitative in the sense that it's more used for relative soil moisture. So whether there's an increase in a location or a decrease over time. It's actually very commonly used in the mining industry for things like monitoring tailings facilities and seeing where there might be potential leakages or flow pathways. So yeah, it's used a lot in mining, in particular, radar for soil moisture.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in that. Just the regional aspect of it is just really appealing to me. Just getting that consistent data over a wide area is just really appealing. Okay, I think that's it for the questions just now. I'm going to hand back to Jack. He wants to finish up.
Sure. So yeah, thanks Ian for chairing the Q&A. Some really interesting and engaging questions. So thank you for sending these through. Just to briefly go over the key messages from the webinar, Drew and Jenny provided an interesting overview of the use of geospatial data in the transport sector and highlighted a few case studies in particular of the use of INSAR as an example, before Ollie and Maddie followed up highlighting the importance of leveraging geospatial data for biodiversity purposes. So just a quick thanks again to Ian for chairing, Drew, Jenny, Ollie and Maddie for presenting and your valuable contributions today. We will be circulating a link to speakers' presentations at a later date, and we will endeavour, I believe we got through all of the questions in the Q&A, but if you do have any additional questions for our speakers or for CIRIA after the webinar, please reach out and we'll get a response back to you as soon as possible. We are keen to hear about your webinar experience today and would be grateful if you could complete this short 4-question poll, which should come on your screen shortly. If you would like to receive a CPD for this webinar, you will need to complete the poll. So it should be popping up just now. There you go. Give you a moment to complete that. Okay. There's just a few final slides about CIRIA news and upcoming events. So as Ian mentioned earlier, we are keen to broaden the member base for our geospatial community of practice, which was supporting today's webinar, and we're always welcome to new organisations signing up. Our members typically benefit from brand exposure through contributing to industry-wide knowledge transfer, demonstrating leadership in improvements towards ESG goals. There's also the opportunity to present at events such as today's webinar and showcase case studies and stuff you've got going on within your day-to-day, and also a chance to participate in CIRIA's wider networking events. Being a member also allows you to influence the scope and direction of the community of practices activities alongside the other members. There is an annual subscription fee, which scales typically to organisational type and size. So if this is something you'd be interested in pursuing for your business, please do get in touch because we're always keen to get new members. To quickly highlight 2 CIRIA projects, which may be of interest to today's audience, given the discussion around slope drainage earlier today. Geotechnical slope drainage, which will lead to guidance on the design, construction, operation and maintenance of slope drainage systems applicable across the UK infrastructure landscape. And the other one on your screen is Sustainable Geosystems in Civil Engineering, which focuses on alternative solutions to the typical carbon-intensive, hard, ground-engineered assets that are typically or traditionally constructed. And it really goes a long way to reflect current industry thinking on carbon cutting within the construction sector in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation moving forward. These are just 2 of our many projects and proposals that we're currently running, and we're eager to collaborate on further. There's plenty others that I really do encourage you to check out on CIRIA's website. 2 events and award things that I think you'd be interested in as well. We're welcoming entries to our SUDS Champion Awards and registrations to the event being held on the 18th of June. So the deadline for entries for the SUDS Champion Awards is the 11th of April, I believe. Yes. And so if you know of anyone that you wish to nominate for an award, please do reach out so we can celebrate their achievements and contribution towards SUDS. Likewise, we are welcoming entries for the Big Biodiversity Challenge, a similar celebration of developments and projects leading to positive contributions towards biodiversity industry goals. There's a number of categories for both of these awards, so feel free to check them out as any project is welcome, from small scale micro projects to larger developments as well. So with that does finally bring us to the end of today's webinar. So thanks again to you all for attending and for our speakers for presenting. I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at some of our future events. So see you soon.